everyone! Hi! Oh my gosh, is it fluff today? Oh, get ready! I was skimming through it while I was highlighting our parts. It's very fluff. Shall we undeafen?
Hello, Innit.
Hello, Innit. Hello, Innit. Are we ready?
No.
Why not?
Yes.
You better be ready, cause it's gonna be a good old time.
Oh, yay.
We're about to get so much fluff, guys. Y'all don't even know. Hold on, I gotta change the music. It's
I'm ready to get fluffy.
good, cause it's very fluffy. Read chapter
Question. Should we do a lore recap?
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad I have you, because last time we forgot to do a lore recap.
Yeah, I know, and people love, so Julie,
you
take
were
it away
always
with the lore.
You were always in charge of telling me to do the lore caps.
I know. Here, I'll stay in charge. I'll stay in charge.
Oh, yes, please.
Julie, there's a lore recap.
There's a lore recap. Okay, and yes, I do have the sound alerts, the loud, annoying ones turned off.
Yes.
All right. Chapters 3 and 4 was pretty heavy with Techno and Wilbur being casted out for being piglin human hybrids. They basically starved to death in a food crate in an alley in the Nether, and Mumsa and Philza weren't having that. So Philza kind of committed some piglin slaughter. Yeah, and basically did a ritual to bring Wilbur and Techno back to life. This sounds so much worse in a recap. Okay, you wrote the darn thing, Emmy. You wrote it. So,
just a bit.
And then, the blood god kind of was all like, you know what? I'm gonna choose the pink-haired one. And so, Techno can kind of hear voices now, but they're alive and well and in the care of Philza and Kristen, and are now the new princes of the Antarctic Empire, the Lamberg Kingdom. You forgot how messed up it is. Why do you think we're doing the reading?
And we got to meet Sapnap and Quackity. So.
Oh my gosh, we did! And Wilbur wanted to dye his hair brown to kind of cut off his piglin ties.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't blame him.
Retweet.
Philza made bacon with that town. So true! So true!
I mean, he kind of did.
He did.
He kind of did.
He did. Alright, but now that the lore recap is done.
Okay.
Give us
Chapter 5.
Yeah.
His eyes were the color of the sea. Trigger warning, implied child abuse. FYI, take care of yourself.
Yeah.
Months passed and life slowly evolved into some semblance of normality for the twins. Sure, every now and then the two would be required to appear by their father whenever he was giving some big speech, but the Emperor tried his best to keep his sons out of public view as much as he could. At the very least, until the boys were a little bit older and better adjusted. Techno's nightmares gradually tapered off in occurrence, but they never stopped. Neither did Wilbur's. But they didn't happen nearly as often anymore. Sure, there were still bad nights. There would always be bad nights, but his sons were finally sleeping through them now. It wasn't long afterward that Phil had started lessons for them. Wilbur flourished and began practically inhaling every book that he could read. Most books were far too advanced for his level, given that he'd never actually had any proper schooling, but for his young age, Wilbur was advancing far quicker in his studies than most children twice his age. Technoblade, on the other hand, seemed to enjoy school and learning new things, but struggled constantly to focus. His mind always wandering during lessons, too crowded to truly focus on the task at hand. It frustrated the child to no end, considering how much he desperately wanted to learn.
Every time I try, they block me out. They're so loud, and it never ends. They want blood. They want to fight. They want attention, but they never listen to what I want. Techno vented to Phil one day after he'd been overwhelmed by the chatter in his head to the point he stumbled from his desk and into the dark corner of the classroom. When the tutor had tried to coax him out, he apparently had growled at her. He might have gone farther if Wilbur hadn't placed himself in between the two. And while the chat in his head craved blood, they also seemed to recognize Techno's own feelings. After the night he'd woken up and attacked Wilbur, the chat had settled considerably in the young boy's mind. Technoblade could sense they felt just as bad about the ordeal as he did. At first, Techno truly believed his chat was a soulless demon that only wanted one thing. But he was wrong. Chat wanted many things, mainly blood, but also affection, happiness, and attention. But above all, they wanted to protect Techno's family.
Chat loved Wilbur as Techno loved Wilbur. Chat wanted affection from Kristen as he often craved it. Chat sought to be comforted by philza whenever he needed it. Chat was almost like a strange entity attached to Techno, flooded with thoughts and emotions of their own that they wanted Techno to listen to. It had taken some time, but eventually, Chat realized that they were hurting Techno and they backed off a bit, becoming a consistent buzzing in the back of his mind. Of course, every now and again, a part of the entity would yell something and all of Chat would begin chanting like a hive mind of bees. Or perhaps Techno would find himself unable to do a task and suddenly Chat would begin screaming for Phil. Maybe Techno would find himself missing his twin whenever they weren't in the same room and Chat would go absolutely feral. And whenever Techno was trying to focus, Chat would get bored and start talking loudly amongst themselves, much to Techno's chagrin. And then there were days like this when Chat's incessant need for blood to be spilled overwhelmed them like an addict who needed their next fix. It was a craving, a want, a need to harm.
And Techno despised them for it. Or at least he wanted to. How do you feel about working with Sam and Puffy? Philza asked one night as the three of them sat together peacefully in the library. The fireplace in front of them crackled soothingly, and the warm heat emanating from the hearth had dulled Chat into a lethargic hum in Techno's mind. It was the quietest they had ever been in the 8 months since he'd first heard them in the alleyway. The three of them were settled atop pillows and blankets built into a small reading nest. Phil, of course, sat in the middle and had The Hero and the Minotaur open on his lap. Wilbur had long since fallen asleep listening to it. The now brunette, much to Techno's disapproval, just because he understood why his brother had dyed his hair didn't mean he had to like it, was curled up against Phil's side with his head resting on his right leg. Techno, on the other hand, was leaning heavily against Phil's left side, completely enthralled by the contents of the book. A deep-rooted thought in the back of his mind that he would never admit to anyone bubbled up in his mind. I can't wait to tell Chat about this story.
Chat, after all, had pretty much fallen asleep alongside Wilbur. He supposed that even the voices in his head need their rest as well. Techno? Phil roused the boy gently from his thoughts, brushing a hand through his long hair. The boy gently tilted up his head, which was leaning against Phil's shoulder, and offered a querying hum. "Did you hear what I asked?" Phil chuckled softly so as not to wake Wilbur, whose glasses sat askew on his face. Techno shuffled through his memory for a moment before finally remembering. Something about Sam and Puffy.
Yes, that's right. I wanted to know how you felt about them giving you lessons. Puffy offered the other day and wanted me to ask, Phil stated, flipping to the next page of the book, then marking it with a slip of paper. Whoa, I lost it. With a slip of paper so their spot was saved. What kind of lessons? Techno wondered, confused since he already had plenty of teachers at this point. Well, I know you've been struggling to focus in class thanks to Chat, so Sam suggested to Puffy that perhaps all you need is an outlet for them. They want to teach you to fight. And oh boy, did Chat stir at the mention of that.
Fight? Fighting Pog. Blood. E.
Dad's a Pog. Fight, fight, fight. I think Wilbur is drooling. Keck W. Techno fight.
Blood for the blood god. Techno winced as a cacophony of voices began yelling in his head, and as quickly as it began, the voices stopped and returned to an unapologetic murmur. It seemed they realized they were interrupting Philza and then stopped immediately. Weird. Yeah, they seemed to like the idea, Techno responded, pinching the bridge of his nose as his head throbbed from sudden overstimulation.
Perfect. I'll talk to Puffy about it the next time I see her and we'll set it up, Phil said with a smile. Techno returned it with a rare one of his own and settled back against his shoulder with a content sigh. You tired, Techno? Do you still want to keep reading? Phil asked, tucking a stray strand of hair back behind his ear. The boy nodded enthusiastically, and Phil chuckled and opened the book once more. Techno lasted another 2 pages before drifting off to sleep as well. Phil decided he didn't need to go back to his office tonight after all. He curled his wings around his 2 sons, and he let his eyes flutter shut.
He dreams of a golden-haired toddler running his fingers softly through a single black raven wing. The wing had a pinkish-red gradient of feathers that trailed from the middle of the wing all the way down to the end feathers. The owner of the wing was tuning a violin while the boy was gently pulling out loose feathers with shaky hands. The detail that philza clung to, however, was that the owner of the wings had long, straight, pink hair that fell to his shoulders. Your Highness, eyes on me. You must stay focused if you want to remain on your feet and stay alive, said the man in front of him. His striking black eyes, and when he said black, he meant there was no white sclera at all in his eye, focused back on his, and the only indication Technoblade had that the man was looking for him was his light gray pupils that reflected himself. His vibrant green hair was pulled up into a small, low half bun that barely held a third of his hair. The creeper hybrid swung his wooden sword overhead, causing the boy to stumble backward, barely able to dodge the attack. His own wooden sword felt heavy in his small hands, unbalanced.
The scrawny 6-year-old decided to utilize his smallness to his advantage and dove under Sam's legs. The man whirled around so fast that Techno had just barely rolled back onto his feet before another slash of the sword was being directed at him. This one unavoidable, as there wasn't enough time for Techno to dive to his right. He scrunched his eyes tightly as he waited for the blow. It never came. Instead, the dull wooden blade stopped a mere inch from Techno's neck. Dead, Sam said without malice or smugness. Instead, he dropped his sword and lifted the boy back to his feet. You did well. You used your height to your advantage. Pride gleamed in his eye, but Techno's brow still furrowed frustratedly anyway.
Still lost, though. I was too slow and my roll was sloppy, Techno said critically. Sam's hand came to rest on his shoulder as he knelt down beside the child. Don't be so hard on yourself. You're the only 6-year-old I know that can fight as hard as you can. Most kids your age can't even pick up a sword. You're a fast learner, and one day you'll be able to knock me flat on my ass. I can already tell. Techno's face burned sheepishly at the praise, and he mumbled out a thanks before handing his sword back to Sam as he did after every session he'd had for the past 3 months. This time, though, Sam shook his head and smiled. Keep it. You've earned it, Your Highness. The man ruffled his hair, and it was only when Sam left that Techno allowed himself to beam giddily to himself.
Chat praising him as well didn't help to wipe the smile off his face. Sam proud. GG, 10%.
Let's go, Technopog. E. Warden Man is proud. You did so well.
Go, pig boy, go. Chat, please. I'm trying so hard not to freak out here. Please calm down, Techno whispered. And for once, they listened and settled back into the familiar hum he'd grown accustomed to over the past year. Your Highness, come here, please. A familiar voice called out, and Techno turned to see Puffy standing at the door that led back inside the castle. Currently, Sam was training Techno in a part of the Emperor's private gardens that had been renovated into a small training ground for Phil and any member of the royal family. The plot of land was surrounded by greenery that the Empress had picked out herself, but hadn't been able to plant because, well, goddess of death.
Ground beneath them was covered by traditional tatami flooring that protected both their feet and the ground itself. Over to the left of them was a small pond with strange, colorful, bug-eyed fish that Techno had never seen before arriving at the castle. Wilbur said they were called koi fish. Techno had called him a nerd. Your Highness, Puffy called out again, humor in her voice as she noticed the prince zoning out again. Sorry, Techno said, ducking his head. He strapped his new sword onto one of the loops on his trousers and ran over to where Puffy was waiting for him.
How was training with Sam today, Your Highness? Puffy asked as she began leading him back inside. He beat me. Again. Not that it was any different when he trained with Puffy. The two were practically legends with their weapons, with Puffy favoring the sword, while Sam leaned more towards an axe or hammer, though he had yet to use either on Techno. Your Highness, if you could beat Sam at the age that you are, Sam wouldn't be the warden anymore, Puffy said with a laugh and patted the young prince gently on the back. Techno merely frowned and decided to change the subject. Where are we going? This doesn't lead back to my room.
I have to make a quick pit stop at the kitchen. Apparently something has been left down there that requires my attention. Not sure what it is, but it's not a threat, so I thought you could come with me, Puffy said cheerfully, her two-toned hair that was tied up into a ponytail swaying behind her. Her normal professional attire was meant only for the captain of the guard, a long dark blue coat accentuated by silver buttons and shoulder guards, matched with dark blue pants. It was meant to complement the more snow blue color that represented the Antarctic Empire. Instead, Puffy wore a white button-down tucked into a high-waisted pair of brown trousers. It was matched with a worn pair of black boots and an orange sash tied around her waist where her shirt was tucked in. She appeared more laid back than usual, without her normally flawless attire. More human. You wear clothes like that more often. You seem a lot more comfortable in it than that stuffy suit, Techno commented, and Puffy let out a laugh, a real one, not the strange chuckle that didn't quite reach her eyes.
I think your dad might have some issues with that, Your Highness. Phil would do anything to ditch his professional attire. He prefers green much more over the light blue monkey suit everyone makes him wear. At the very least, he seems more like Phil when he wears green, more like my dad. Well, you know what I mean. Techno cut himself off. It wasn't that he didn't see Phil as his father, he absolutely did. He just wasn't quite ready to verbalize it, and neither was Wilbur. It didn't seem to bother Phil in the slightest, however. He knew he was their father, and they knew it too, so what was the rush? Yes, very much so, but unfortunately as the Emperor, he's expected to always look respectable. It's a standard that you and your brother will also be expected to conform to one day.
Techno wrinkled his nose at that. As the two drew near the servants' hall, Techno could begin to hear the busied voices of the kitchen staff who were hard at work preparing enough food to feed an entire castle. They entered the main kitchen, and Techno instinctively ducked behind Puffy's legs as every eye in the room turned to him. Collectively, the room acknowledged his presence as people around him curtsied or bowed to the young prince. A large woman with graying hair came up to Puffy and said in a sickly sweet voice that grated at his ears, "Your Highness and the captain are most welcome down here. I assume you received the message I sent, correct?" A small boy with dark hair and a shiner on his left eye caught Techno's attention from underneath one of the tables.
Quackity? Yes, now, what's this all about? Puffy answered as Techno grinned at Quackity while he mockingly impersonated the kitchen lady without making any sound. Instead, he acted out her over-the-top expressions and stuck-up posture. From the corner of his eye, Techno could see Puffy try to stifle a smile. Techno had to stifle his laughter with his hand when the boy began doing his impression of a penguin by waddling on his knees. At one point, he accidentally thudded his head on the wood, and Techno bit his tongue to keep from bursting into laughter. Eventually, after a moment, Quackity decided he'd had enough and crawled out from under the table. "Your Highness," the voice said, giving Techno a mock salute. The lady whirled around, and her face went bright red angry at the sight of the boy. If he squinted, Techno was positive he could see smoke coming from her ears.
"Boy, I thought I told you to..." The crabby old woman began before Techno gracefully cut her off and said warmly, "Hello, Quackity. I haven't seen you in a bit. Wilbur misses you." Quackity rolled his eyes at that and grinned. "He should come to visit me more often then, but tell him I suppose I miss his highness as well." Suddenly, his eyes widened as he recalled the reason he was here. He completely disregarded the two adults and grabbed Techno's hand. "Come on, dude, follow me! I've got to show you something."
The two boys darted off with Puffy yelling out to wait for her. Techno swore he heard the head cook mutter out something vile at his friend. They rounded a corner into what looked like a smaller kitchen with a back door that Techno guessed was where grocers dropped off the palace supplies. The room was surprisingly empty, with most of the staff being in the main kitchen at the moment. However, sitting on one of the mainly large oaken tables meant to prepare food was a rain-soaked box. "You wanted to show me a box?" Techno asked, his tone flat. Quackity rolled his eyes and nudged his shoulder. "Inside the box, genius. Take a look."
There was a chair next to the table that appeared tall enough for Techno to climb onto. He hoisted himself onto the stool and then onto the table. His brain shorted a bit when he heard something coo. Techno turned to the box and looked inside. Sitting in the box was a baby. A boy, maybe 6 or 7 months old, with dark brown hair and equally brown goat-like ears, stared back at him. His eyes were so blue they looked like sapphires sparkling back at him. He was wearing a threadbare long-sleeved green onesie that was way too big for him. The baby noticed Techno and made a grabbing motion at him.
"Found him about an hour ago when I was bringing in food. Someone just dumped him at the door like garbage. I nearly stepped on the little guy." Quackity frowned and climbed up beside Techno. The baby immediately lost interest in the prince and babbled something incoherent at Quackity. Think he likes you, Techno said with a laugh as the baby tried to gnaw on one of his fingers. Whoever left him at least bothered to leave a note. Miss Jenkins is reading it to the captain, I think. Apparently, the mom named someone to take care of him, his father or something. I don't know. I didn't have time to read it before she snatched it from me. Is she the one who gave you that? Techno's hand pointed to the nasty bruise on his left eye. From what he could tell, it looked pretty recent.
Nah. Quackity brushed off casually. I got this from running into a door. It was just an accident. Lie. He's lying. Chat whispered amongst themselves, and Techno nodded, internally promising that he'd tell Phil about it. Instead, Techno gave the boy a strange smile. If you say so, dude.
Eager to change the subject, Quackity piped. Oh! The letter said his name, too. The raven-haired boy leaned over the box and made a face at the baby. Isn't that right, Tubbo? Quackity grinned as he crossed his eyes and stuck out his tongue, causing Tubbo to burst into giggles. Suddenly, voices echoed behind them. I'd like to see this for myself now, please. Move aside. Puffy growled. Fine, suit yourself. But I already informed the head of the orphanage about him. There's no reason to bother him with this boy. The head cook growled, and the two boys could hear as she stomped away. Puffy rounded the corner looking exasperated and groaned. Goddess above, I thought she'd never shut up.
Quackity shot back with a smirk on his face. She never does. Puffy walked behind the two boys and peered over them to take a long look at Tubbo. Techno could hear her sharply inhale as she took in his features. The captain was silent for a long time, not moving in the slightest as she stared at the baby with a thoughtful look. Eventually, Techno spoke. Puff? What is it? Suddenly, Puffy growled, but it wasn't directed at any of them. I'm going to throttle him. Who? Quackity said, when the captain didn't further elaborate. Puffy didn't respond. She simply pinched at the bridge of her nose as if she had a headache. She looked extremely stressed.
Finally, the captain took a deep breath and looked at the two. Quackity, I need you to go find Sapnap and ask him to tell his father that he needs to meet me in my office as soon as possible. Can you do that? The 7-year-old hopped off the table and stood tall in front of the captain, as if he'd just been given some heroic quest. He saluted Puffy and proclaimed, I'll do my best, Captain. Puffy gave a strained smile as he darted out of the room. She then turned to Techno. Your Highness, I need you to take Tubbo and go find His Majesty. I believe he's with Wilbur in the library at the moment. Normally, I wouldn't leave you alone like this without an escort, but I have some very important calls to make now. One of the guards should be able to help you to the library. Can you do this? I can. Techno nodded his head affirmatively and hopped off the table. Puffy picked up Tubbo from his box and handed him to the young prince.
Oof, you're heavy, Techno griped as he wobbled for a minute before steadying himself. Puffy's hands were placed precariously under the baby, making sure Techno wasn't going to drop him. The prince noticed her expression and reassured her. Don't worry, Captain. I got him. You sure? Puffy said, unconvinced. Techno shifted Tubbo higher up in his arms and was able to gain a much more secure grasp on the squirming baby. He turned to face the captain. I got him. And with that, Techno set off with Tubbo towards the library.
Puffy, slow down. At least tell me where we are going. Ow! Ow, ow, ow! Ear! Puff! Schlatt winced as he was harshly dragged through the hallway by his ear. The sheep was fucking furious, and Jay Schlatt had no idea why. She had just burst into his office with a look so dark it could probably kill, and began tugging him violently along after her. From what the ram could tell, they were making their way up through the main part of the castle to Phil's office. Schlatt swallowed nervously. Just how badly had he fucked up? Suddenly, Puffy stopped and whirled around, her fist gripped tightly around his collar. She slammed Schlatt up against a wall, and her eyes flashed red as she hissed.
I will not send that boy to an orphanage, Jay Schlatt. I will not. You are a fucking adult, and this is your fault. He didn't ask for this life. You gave it to him. I refuse to let you ruin his life just because you're too chicken shit to be a father. Schlatt stared blankly at her for what seemed like hours, his mind refusing to process what the captain had just screamed at him. Eventually, he rasped out through his teeth. What the fuck are you talking about? Suddenly, from down the hallway, Schlatt saw Wilbur peek his head from the Emperor's office. The boy cups his hands around his mouth and shouts, Phil says you aren't allowed to murder Schlatt before him. Put him down, Captain.
What the hell is going on? The captain let him drop to the floor, muttering curses as she stalked off, but not before glaring at Schlatt one more time. Schlatt's knees wobbled as he slid down the wall towards the ground. He eyed the Emperor's office nervously. I am so fired, aren't I? A hand tugged Jay Schlatt from his thoughts, and the brunette looked up to see Wilbur grunting with effort as he tried to pull the man to his feet.
Move your butt! Wilbur strained, and while normally this would cause Schlatt to laugh and tease the brunette, this time the ram just listened and shakily stood to his feet. The prince dragged him along, bringing him inside Philza's office. As soon as he was inside, Wilbur gently patted Schlatt on the arm as sympathetically as he could, and then darted out of the room. Schlatt could hear the young prince giggle as he met his brother, and they sprinted to their room. He looked around the office and saw Phil standing by the window. The blonde was facing away from Schlatt, but something was making noise in his arms. Schlatt took a shaky breath. Your Majesty? His voice cracked unnaturally. The man didn't think he'd ever been so uncomposed in his life, but right now he was fucking terrified at whatever was about to happen.
Did you know he existed, Schlatt? Or did you just ignore and refuse to acknowledge him at all? Tell me the truth. Phil's voice was barely above a whisper as it growled darkly through the room. What on earth are you talking about? Will someone please tell me what's going on? Schlatt cried, his hands digging into his hair. Phil's voice boomed loudly throughout the room. Did you know you had a son, Jay Schlatt? Schlatt's words turned to dust in his mouth as everything in his world seemed to freeze in time. Everything except him, Phil, and the baby sitting in Phil's arms that was still out of Schlatt's sight.
I have a son? Schlatt echoed, his eyes wide and terrified as he racked through his brain for how, when, where, who, etc. He'd been with a few girls in the past, sure, but none of them had ever lasted longer than a week. And suddenly now he had a kid? How could this have happened? What was he supposed to do? And then Phil turned around and suddenly none of it mattered. All that mattered was the blue-eyed boy with hair as brown as his own and ram-like ears that were too big for his head staring back at him. Schlatt took an unconscious step forward as he took in the sight of this tiny creature that resembled him so much you would have to be blind to not see it. His heart pounded in his chest. There was no way the little boy who had his hands in his mouth was his own.
He could never create something so perfect. It was impossible. Or at least had been, because the evidence was staring him down with dark blue eyes that resembled the sea. Not the greenish blue murky water or the crystal clear waves, no. His eyes reminded him of the ocean Puffy had described to him when they'd made their way through 2 large bottles of rum one night, not long after Philza had woken. When the sky was so clear and the waves so smooth that you couldn't tell the ocean from the azure sky above it. That was the color of the eyes that looked back at him. I'll take that as a no then, Phil chuckled. All the anger in his voice had vanished as he watched Schlatt's entranced expression. Tubbo looked at Schlatt with a curious expression. He babbled something to himself, and then with 2 tiny chubby fists, he reached for him.
Aw. Schlatt stretched out a hand without thinking, and then pulled back, hesitant and terrified. Once he did this, there was no going back. He wouldn't be able to live with himself if he changed his mind or chickened out. This was the moment where Schlatt had to decide. I won't force you into this, Schlatt. If you don't think you can provide him a good life, then I'll find a family who can. Either way, Tubbo gets a chance to live a happy life with a family that loves him. You just have to decide if you're meant to be that family. Philza promised. His eyes sincere as he smiled at his friend. What if I screw up? What if I fail him? Schlatt's voice choked in his throat, swelling with emotion as he was fighting desperately hard not to convey. Tubbo fussed in Phil's arms, still reaching for Schlatt.
We're all scared to fail our children, Schlatt. I know I am. Every day I look at my boys in fear that I won't be good enough, that I won't be able to protect them or teach them to be strong. I worry that I might lose them one day, Phil explained, and then looked down at Tubbo. But I also know that every time I look at my sons, I know I would move mountains for them. I see that same look in your eyes now. You've already made up your mind. You made it up the moment you saw him. I did. Schlatt gritted, flinching when Tubbo let out a cry from being ignored. Then take him. He's your son. Schlatt gently slid his hands under the child's arms and lifted him out of Phil's arms and looked into his own. Instantly, Tubbo stilled and stared at Schlatt. His small hands poked around at his jacket and tugged on his crooked tie before finding their way up to his face. With one hand secure around the baby, the ram's other came to press against one of Tubbo's hands.
Oh. Tubbo flattened his palm against Schlatt's, and the man looked in awe at how his own hand dwarfed the boy's. What's his name? Does he have one already, or... Schlatt wondered, turning back to Phil, who had been watching the two with a fond look in his eye. The man cleared his throat and answered. Tubbo. His name is Tubbo. Bad looked over him when he arrived and guesses he's around 6 months old. Tubbo. His son. I have a son. Hello, Tubbo, Schlatt said softly and cracked a smile when the baby's small, furry ears perked up at the sound of his name. Tubbo smiled back, a toothless grin.
Absolutely perfect, Schlatt murmured when the boy leaned into his shoulder, content to rest in his father's arm after his long journey. My perfect Tubbo.
You can't do this to me. You can't do this to me.
I'm doing it to you, baby.
I can't do this.
Emmy's doing it to you, baby.
Oh.
Dad Schlatt! Dad Schlatt! Dad Schlatt!
I literally would have to mute my mic because I was bouncing. I was bouncing in my chair with how much I was crying.
Gosh.
This is adorable. I want to cry.
That is funny to me. Oh, yes! My favorite chapter!
Oh,
yeah,
no,
baby!
bro.
Woo! That was what I was waiting for.
Please tell me this is all fluff.
It's all fluff.
Okay, it's all fluff. Yes!
It's
and
fluff. Go for it.
Are you ready?
I'm born ready.
Chapter 6. Theseus. 1 month later. The feeling of a gentle hand running through his curls is what stirs Wilbur from his slumber. He sighed into the touch and pushed more against the soft hand, wanting more. Instead, the hand recedes, causing Wilbur to whine softly in retaliation. Open your eyes, my son.
Kristen? Wilbur whispered into the darkness, and his eyes shot open, red pinpricks illuminating the dark room faintly. He sat up in his bed and gently unwrapped himself from Techno's tight grip. The boy looked around for his mother, and his eyes furrowed in confusion when he found no trace of her. Was it just a dream? No, I'm sure it was her. The door to his room was wide open, and the hallway outside was dark. Fear chilled down his spine. That light never turned off. Something was off. Phil promised he'd always keep that light on, and every night for the past year he had, until now. He turned to Techno and shook his arm. Tick, wake up. Something's wrong.
The boy didn't stir. A deeply rooted fear stirred in his chest, reminding him of those last few days in the Nether, when Wilbur had to rouse himself awake from his own sickly haze to shake his brother awake. If they stayed asleep for too long, they might never wake up. Nowadays, Techno wasn't exactly a heavy sleeper. Something was very, very wrong. Do not panic, Wilbur. Brother is simply sleeping. Come find me, my son. I have something to show you. How can I follow what I can't see? Wilbur whimpered into the darkness. He didn't like the dark. He'd never had to deal with it in the Nether. It was scary, and you never knew what was lurking within. Follow the light, Wilbur. Follow the light to me.
As if on cue, a wisp of light flickered to life in the center of the room. It glowed a golden yellow and just barely illuminated the floor beneath him. The boy hopped out of his bed and grabbed his sweatshirt that was crumpled on the ground by his feet. He smoothed it over his white nightshirt and hastily slipped his shoes onto his feet on the way out. Just to be safe, he grabbed the candle from his bedside and lit it just in case the wisp in front of him vanished and left him alone. Leave the candle, Wilbur. You won't need it. I won't let you become lost. He sighed, but listened to his mother's words and set it back at the bedside for Techno, just in case he ended up waking up after all.
Wilbur tiptoed towards the ball of light and watched in awe as it danced around him. He reached out to try to touch it, but the moment he did, it dispersed into sparks. Instantly, another took its place, but this one was located outside his room. He followed it into the hallway, his red eyes reflecting the golden light it emitted. For each light he walked to, he would poke it away, giggling when it burst into a gentle rainfall of golden fragments. The farther he made it down the hall, the brighter each light glowed. Eventually, he entered a hallway and area of the castle he wasn't familiar with, but the lights never failed to urge him forward, closer and closer to his unknown goal. Finally, the lights came to a stop in front of the set of tall spruce doors.
Wilbur watched with fascination in his eyes as the ball changed its shape to fit through the cracks in the door. Wilbur grabbed at the handles and pulled hard. The door was heavy, far too heavy for one his size. The wisps seemed to realize this, and a few of them grouped together to help the prince open the door. Eventually, he managed to pry the door about a foot wide and slip inside. The moment he does, something magical happened. Multiple wisps morph into long tendrils of light that swirl around him and throughout the room, creating ribbons of gold that stem into the center of the room. All the light caused the room to illuminate before his eyes, making the tall stone walls that structured the room visible. It was a mostly empty chamber with a long green carpet that led to a bed of gold. Wilbur had never seen this place before, but it seemed important. The strings of light swirled in front of him, trying to grab back his attention.
Okay, I'm coming. Wilbur smiled, and the light seemed to grin back as it led him to the center of the room. Ribbons of gold gathered in front of the brunette's feet before seeping into the ground as water would for a thirsty plant. And then, a golden flower of light sprouts from the floor. It was like no flower Wilbur had seen before. There were no tangible petals or stems except for the geometric shapes the light had bent into. Wilbur sank to his knees in front of the flower, peering over it curiously. And then he did the first thing any 6-year-old would do. He gently touched the flower with his forefinger.
The flowers scattered away into the air, and Wilbur thought that it would be the end, until suddenly the room filled with more wisps than the prince had seen yet. They floated around the room and briefly took the form of lanterns that one would send traveling into the air, and then they exploded into a shower of golden fireworks. The remnants crossed in front of the boy, and another shape formed in front of him. This time, it was a bird, made from fire, that emerged from the rays of gold. Hues of red, yellow, and orange made up the bird, and its wings which spread for Wilbur as it soared around the room. No matter how hard he tried, though, he couldn't remember the name of the bird. "I'm sorry, I can't remember what kind of bird you are, but you're very pretty, Mr. Bird," Wilbur said apologetically, and the bird cawed understandingly. The golden bird came to land in front of the prince, and once again the boy stretched out his hand.
He was half piglin after all, so he knew he was at least somewhat fireproof. The firebird cooed and rubbed against Wilbur's palm before moving to sit in front of him. Unbeknownst to the prince, the lights had begun swirling around him again. It bloomed around him into the shape of the golden flower once more, but this time, Wilbur and the fiery creature made up the center. The bird looked up at Wilbur and let out an affectionate chirp before it transformed for the last time before his eyes. It wrapped its wings around itself, causing its body and head to disappear from sight. Soon enough, the wings vanished as well and left something small and fragile on the ground in front of him. A group of wisps around moved closer to him to help light up the area for the prince to see. And as his vision focused back, a cry echoed through the room that caused his voice to catch in his throat.
It was high-pitched and tiny sounding, but it was still somehow the most beautiful noise Wilbur had ever heard. It was the cry of a baby. Sitting in front of Wilbur, wrapped in a soft red blanket, was a small infant with bright blue eyes and a head full of golden hair. The blonde was now wailing, and this time the noise was a lot less musical and a lot more loud and annoying. Around the baby's neck was a golden chain with a gold pendant that had an eerily familiar diamond-shaped emerald fused to it. Unconsciously, Wilbur's hand traveled to his own pointed ear, to the single emerald earring that dangled from it. Techno himself had a matching one that hung from his opposite ear to mirror his twin.
It had been Phil's gift to his sons for their 6th birthday. When piglin children are born, they are usually given a gold earring at birth. Wilbur had long since thrown his away, but Techno still held on to his, saying that he didn't want to forget where he came from. It was just one of those things that the two would never see eye to eye. So when they were gifted the expertly crafted earring, Wilbur refused to take his off, deciding to fully attach himself to his new life in the overworld and leave his old, painful past in the dust. Techno had simply asked to get another piercing. He moved his old gold hoop to his lower lobe, while the emerald would hang high at the tip of his ear, like Wilbur's.
Wilbur looked down at the baby again, and then the necklace. Surely it wasn't an accident that he had it. It was practically a tradition that only members of the immediate royal family were given emeralds. It was a symbol of their status. For Kristen, it was the emerald in her wedding ring. For Phil, it was the centerpiece of his crown, though he also had one that would dangle off of his signature striped hat. No, this wasn't an accident. This baby, does this mean? Wilbur's thoughts raced in his mind as the realization began to sink in. The brunette leaned forward and scooped the infant securely into his arms. Instantly, the cries ceased their unpleasant melody, and the infant stared up at him with a look that was just as curious as Wilbur's. He was so tiny.
Just a little creature whose eyes contrasted his own. Wilbur already knew his own drove would have slaughtered the child on sight. How could something so fragile and defenseless possibly make it in such a world? An emotion Wilbur was heavily familiar with pulled into his chest as the baby continued to stare at him. The prince pulled back the blanket slightly and freed one of the baby's hands from its swaddle. He gently pressed his own hand against the blonde's and let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. The infant managed to free his other hand with its binding and pressed the one to Wilbur's hand as well. One of the hands moved up and tightly wrapped itself around the brunette's thumb. Finally, he spoke. "Where on earth did you come from, little guy? Did the bird bring you to me?" Suddenly, he furrowed his eyebrows. "Did Kristen bring you to me?"
A bit of golden thread from the side of the baby blanket caught Wilbur's attention. It was carefully stitched in flawless cursive to say a name. Theseus. Your name is Theseus? Wilbur asked, as if the baby had the ability to answer him back. Instead, Theseus let out a wad of spit bubble out of his mouth, causing Wilbur to giggle. Ew, gross. Theseus simply gave him an odd-looking smile back. Though, to be completely honest, it's probably just gas. Well, Theseus, my name is Wilbur. Can you say that? Wilbur? Theseus simply tugged on Wilbur's hand in response, babbling at the name.
"Yes, you're probably too young for words. It's okay. Tubbo can't talk yet either. You'll like Tubbo, I think. He's like our little cousin. He's not very fun to play with yet, but he will be. And don't worry, Techno and I know lots of baby games we can play until you're big like us." Wilbur took a deep breath and smiled. "I know you can't really understand me yet, but I just want you to know. I'll keep you safe, Theseus, I promise." "Wilbur!" A voice from outside the dark echoed. It was frantic and eerily familiar. He heard shuffling by the door and could see light shining from under the doorway. As if on cue, the wisps vanished from sight, leaving him and Theseus in almost total darkness. "Dad?" Wilbur called out, a bit frightened by the dark as he stood from the ground with Theseus carefully held up in his arms. He shifted up his elbow to gently raise the infant's head, just like Puppy had shown him for Tubbo.
"Phil, I'm here!" Wilbur tried again, but this time he heard another voice call out. "Idiot, did you get stuck behind the door?" Techno. "Come in and find out. I think you'll like what I found," Wilbur said, smiling down at Theseus, who was shrouded by darkness. The door opened and light flooded into the room as his father and brother rushed inside. Wilbur quickly concealed Theseus a bit with the blankets, so as to not make it overtly obvious what he was holding.
Phil quickly lit the oil lanterns in the room, and the pit in Wilbur's stomach vanished as the light returned. He stayed with his back turned to him, and he spoke. "Wilbur Soot Watson, I thought I told you. No, I've said multiple times you cannot go wandering around the castle alone at night. It isn't safe." Wilbur looked up and saw Technoblade staring at him from the doorway with his eyes wide. His gaze specifically focused on the bundle of red fabric curled in his arms. Wilbur motioned over him as Phil continued to scold him. Techno looked down in wonder at the baby in his brother's arms. Theseus was quick to catch one of Techno's fingers with his hands, holding it just as tightly as he had for Will.
I understand wanting to see your friends, but you cannot visit them during the day, son. In fact, you could get hurt going out like this at night, and I've warned you about running off countless times. I'm afraid this time there will be some Dad, shut up and turn around, would you? Wilbur said, rolling his eyes. Hey, no, take that back. I will not have the first time either of you calls me Dad be used to get yourself out of trouble. At least wait for your mother to get hit. Finally, Phil cut off as he turned around. His face went white as a sheet as he spotted the bundle in Wilbur's arms. The man froze dead in his tracks, staring blankly with an expression Wilbur didn't quite understand. As quickly as it appeared, it was gone, and something warm sparkled in his eyes instead. He slowly walked over to the boys and sank to the ground, crossing his legs.
Wilbur turned and sat in his father's lap, giggling when he felt Phil's beard tickle against his cheek as the man looked down at Theseus. Techno sat in front of Wilbur, his eyes still refusing to leave the tiny infant. He heard his father breathe out softly to himself. Oh, thank you, my love. He's perfect. Can we keep him? Techno asked, refusing still to look up. Phil let out a breathless laugh as he ran his fingers gently through Theseus's short blonde hair.
Of course we can, my son, of course. Besides, I want to see Puffy and Schlatt's face when they see him. It will be priceless, Phil said with a laugh. Does this mean he's our little brother? Wilbur asked while shifting slightly to secure Theseus in his arms. The baby let out a yawn, seemingly tuckered out from all of the attention, though he still continued to look around at everyone. Yes, Wilbur, it means he's your little brother, which means you both have to look out for him the way you do for each other, okay? Can you promise me that? Phil asked, his voice serious but warm. I promise, Wilbur piped up immediately with a smile. Clearly, he already adored the infant. Techno, ever the more stoic of his children, finally looked up and said firmly, I promise.
The pink-haired boy looked down once more and finally noticed the name scrawled on the side of the blanket. A small smile appeared on his face. Theseus. Huh? I like it. Prince Theseus of the Antarctic Empire, younger brother to the heirs to the throne. In celebration of the prince's birth, the royal family released a floating lantern into the sky and set off golden fireworks to honor the young prince along with his brothers. A month later, a giant mosaic of the family was erected in the town square, dedicated to the now completed royal family. The news spread far and wide throughout the kingdom of the arrival of the new prince, and eventually reached the ears of a young mage with a short brown hair and large white glasses. The brunette paled as he read the contents of the letter. His heart pounded in his chest as a wave of anxiety washed over him.
It's beginning. Finally, after taking a moment to stifle the anxiety in his chest, he gently tucked the letter back into its envelope and rushed from his study. He threw on his boots as he headed out of the door to the small training area they had hastily constructed when they moved here 5 years ago. As he entered the fenced-out area, he saw no sign of his best friend. That was until a chilling voice creeped down from the rafters above. I heard him. He says the kid has been born, Dream hissed, causing George to raise a brow at the green-eyed blonde. Eventually he spoke, voice dripping with sarcasm. Thought you'd be happy about this. I mean, it's not like we haven't been waiting 1,000 years in the dock for this day to arrive.
Be happier once we're finally free, Dream snarled. His eyes softened at George's frown, and he sighed, rubbing the anger from his expression. He hopped down from his perch, barely rustling a leaf as he hit the ground, and stalked over to his partner. I suppose it was about time, anyway. I don't want to be nearing 50 when we finally finish this. The boy's healing ability will be strong enough to keep us young. It won't keep us from aging, but it will slow down considerably. Now stop pouting, will you? Dream proceeded to grimace even more, causing the brunette to snort back a laugh. We still have 5 years before his markings show anyway. Plenty of time for us to secure a base for ourselves where they won't ever find him. If we play this right, they'll never even know he was a phoenix at all. George grinned and wrapped his arm around the taller man.
Aren't you ever the clever one, Gogs? Dream snarked and pushed down his glasses. Say we wait a few years. What about his memory? The kid is bound to remember something. George smacked away his hands and readjusted his glasses. Relax. I've got a plan for that too. Now pack your shit and let's go. You know, he's not going to break in your arms, darling. His mother's voice rang softly in his ears as the pink-haired boy hung over his brother's crib, watching as he slept peacefully. I know, but I prefer to watch. Techno murmured into his sleeve and smiled when he felt her hand run through his long, unbraided hair.
Well, you spent about 2 months watching. While we try holding him for a change, Kristen said sweetly, her hands gently sliding under Techno's underarms as she effortlessly lifted the boy off of the railing and placed him on the floor. Kristen, I'm not so sure. Techno began only to be brushed off as she knelt down in front of him. Nonsense. There's nothing to be afraid of, Techno. You held Tubbo just fine when he arrived. What's so different about Theseus?
A pit settled in Techno's stomach, and the boy looked to the floor. He probably would have stayed silent if Chat hadn't been incessantly screaming at him. Tell Mother! Mumza!
You won't drop-kick the child. We believe in you. Hold top, Theseus.
Oh.
Tell Mumza.
Kristen, Techno began. He fiddled nervously with his cufflinks, snapping them in and out of place. Yes, Techno? Aren't you worried I might hurt him? I mean, Will is just a much safer choice than me, you know? He's better than I am with Theseus, and... His eyes didn't leave the ground until a hand under his chin forced his gaze to meet his mother's bright purple eyes, shining with something akin to horror, but not directed at him. Technoblade Alexander Watson. Oh, where is this coming from? I know you would never hurt Theseus.
But Techno furrowed his brow, confused. Isn't that why you didn't wake me the day Wilbur found Theseus? What? Kristen looked equally confused, and Techno sighed, trying to figure out how to get out of what he was trying to say. The day Theseus arrived, you woke up Wilbur, but you didn't wake up me. I didn't understand why, and for a little while it hurt. Why did Wilbur get to meet our little brother first? It's not fair. Then I figured it was because I'm dangerous. His mother sunk to her knees and softly held Techno's face within her nimble hands. She brushed back a elusive strand of hair, tucking it behind his long pointed ears, and whispered sorrowfully,
Oh, my son, that's not it at all. I'm so sorry. I should have realized that you felt left out. I never even thought about it. I'm so sorry. You are not dangerous, Techno. You are strong, yes, and one day I know you will be a warrior to be feared, but that is not the reason I woke Wilbur up and not you. You are not dangerous, and you are not the monster you tell yourself are. Techno's throat grew tight with emotion, and he coughed once, trying to keep his expression blank. And then he realized that he didn't need to. This was Kristen. This was his mother. Kristen pulled the boy into her arms, weaving her fingers through his hair as she spoke. Techno let himself be held like a toddler, just this once, and he rested his head against her shoulder. I didn't wake you up because I knew you wouldn't follow.
Technoblade shot upright, confused. Huh? His mother laughed at his expression and untangled a few more knots in his hair with her fingers. You're stubborn and cautious like your father. Wilbur could have easily been following a stranger using magic and would have never even known the difference. You, on the other hand, would have fought me every step of the way, believing wholeheartedly that it was a trap. That's why I woke you up after Wilbur was gone. Because, unlike your brother, you went to get Phil the moment I started leading you down the hall.
Techno let out a shaky exhale as relief washed over him. It was like a weight had been lifted off of his chest. His mother trusted him. She trusted him even though he knew he was dangerous. She trusted him with the most precious gift Techno had ever received, which is saying a lot considering she also brought him back from the dead. Theseus, his little brother. Only 4 months old, and already he was beginning to show the world his fiery personality. He would cry whenever Wilbur put him back in his crib, or whenever Techno let go of his hand. He was fascinated to no end by his appearance in the mirror. He'd already developed an attachment to a toy Sam had gifted him, a stuffed cow with a brown and white coat. And just recently, he smiled for the first time. A real smile. Techno was a bit jealous it hadn't been him Theseus had smiled for.
It was Tubbo that had caused the baby to grin for the first time when the 11-month-old had tried a game of peekaboo with him. Apparently, he'd learned it from Schlatt. Not that the ram would ever admit it. A warm feeling blossomed into his chest. He was trusted. So what you're saying is Wilbur is just an idiot. Techno grinned as he pushed his thoughts aside. No, Wilbur is very book smart, but unfortunately when it comes to common sense... Kristen winced, looking terribly guilty to admit it.
What I'm trying to say is your brother is a bit more naive than you are. That's just a fancy way of saying he's an idiot. Techno countered, and Kristen shook her head in mock exasperation. Stop twisting my words, you little gremlin. You and your brother each share an equal part of my heart. No one is less or greater than the other. You didn't deny it, Techno sang happily, and his mother's expression warped into one of mischief. Before he knew it, Kristen was tickling him mercilessly. Techno squealed, unable to get out of her grasp, but his smile never leaves his face, and his laughter never turns to one of pain.
Okay, you win! I take it back! Mom, I take it back! Ah! The hands disappear and Techno inhales as his chest stops spasming. He sits up and finds his mother grinning ear to ear, tears shining in her eyes. You called me Mom. That's the first time you've... Kristen inhaled shakily, eyes still shining. Suddenly, her expression is playful once more. I win the bet. Oh. What bet? Techno's ears perked up with curiosity. Kristen stands to her feet and hoists Techno in her arms despite his half-hearted complaints. Kristen laughs, joyfully and presses a kiss to her son's temple. Your father and I had a bet over who you would call Mom or Dad to first, and I just won.
You guys gambled over my affection? Techno said in a mock-offending tone. In truth, it meant a lot to him that they cared so much for him. Schlatt, Puffy, and Sam placed bets as well, Kristen said, wincing. So who did they think would win? Techno tried his best to look truly offended, even crossing his arms to sell it even further. But alas, Wilbur was the one who was better at theatrics. A wobbly smile involuntarily spread across his face, and Kristen beamed. That's a secret, but let's just say Tubbo's going to be spoiled rotten.
Suddenly, the sound of incoherent baby noises pulls their attention away from their conversation, and Techno smiles when he sees Theseus staring at him from his crib. Somehow, he'd managed to roll over from his back onto his stomach and was gripping at the bars on the crib. Techno leaned over to the side to look at Theseus upside down, which was apparently something he found hilarious. Hi, Theseus, Techno giggled, and then winced when Chat began collectively awing Theseus's laughter at the same time. The baby stuck his hand out of the crib, reaching for him. Techno smiled and went to sit on the floor by the crib. He stuck his hand up to the bars and felt warmth pulled in his chest when his little brother instantly grabbed it.
He weaved his free hand through the bars and into Theseus's hair, brushing out the golden curls delicately with his fingers. His eyes softened when Theseus moved closer to the edge of the crib, trying to get closer to him. He wants you to hold him, Techno, Kristen said softly. And suddenly the feeling was back. The horrible, gnawing feeling in his gut that he could hurt him. He was so small and delicate, like a glass bird in his hands. I can't do it. Techno shook his head, his expression crumbling like dust. Kristen let out a hum and walked over to the crib. She gently gathered Theseus in her arms and lifted him from the crib. Then she knelt on the floor beside Techno. Bend your arms inward a bit and lift your arms. I won't let anything bad happen. Just trust me, okay? His mother's voice was so soft, so reassuring, and so loving at that moment. Finally, Techno let out a breath and nodded before positioning himself. He crossed his legs and stretched out his shaky hands.
Kristen gently set Theseus in his arms, and then moved so that her arms were under his to support him. Techno went stiff as a rod the moment he felt Theseus, fear bubbling up again. Chat, to his complete shock, immediately erupted into cheers and praises, before quieting down again as not to overwhelm him. Relax, Technoblade. He's not glass. He's not going to shatter in your arms. Take a deep breath and relax, Kristen murmured, pressing a kiss to his forehead. Inhale, exhale, release the tension, repeat.
Theseus simply stared at him, smiling at his brother. His hands reached up and tugged at the white streak of hair that normally fell in front of his face. Ow, Techno said, calmly, if not a bit uncomfortably, but didn't dare move to pry Theseus's hands from his hair. Instead, Techno finally let his arms relax and shifted Theseus's head a bit higher. His other hand rested at the baby's side, keeping him steady. Eventually, Kristen pulled her hands away when Techno grew more confident. She scooted back a bit and smiled at her sons.
See? You're a natural, she grinned. Who's a natural? A voice rang from the doorway, and both of them turned to see Phil and Wilbur peering in at them curiously. Both of them had been out for the day looking for a guitar for Wilbur to begin practicing on. He's been begging Phil for weeks for one, and Phil had finally caved. It wasn't because it was expensive or anything like that. Phil hadn't gotten him one yet because, as he put it, Wilbur needs to prove to me that he's responsible enough to care for the instrument and not treat it as a toy he can play with for a few weeks and then ditch. Which, in Wilbur's case, was a valid argument.
Oh. The two filed into the room, and Phil's face lit up at the sight of Techno. Oh, look at you, mate. Your mother was right. You are a natural. Phil grinned, and then kneeled down next to his wife, wrapping an arm around her shoulder. Wilbur was positively beaming as well, and happily crouched down next to his brother, leaning his head into Techno's shoulder. See? I told you nothing to worry about. Phil, guess what? Phil said, her tone sugary sweet, and Techno could sense the mischief a mile away. This ought to be good. Yes, dear? Phil turned to her with a smile and all the love in the world shining in his blue eyes.
Techno, sweetheart. Do you mind saying what you said earlier for your father? Kristen grinned evilly, and Phil visibly paled as the realization kicked in. Of course I would, Mom, Techno said flatly, but made sure to enunciate the last word. Philza groaned in defeat, burying his face in his hands while Kristen burst into laughter. Wilbur was holding his stomach as he cackled loudly into Techno's shoulder at his father's defeated expression. Even Techno was having difficulty holding in his laughter. He instead looked down at Theseus' own expression as the infant looked at his family curiously.
After a moment of playful bickering, Kristen leaned against her angel's side and said triumphantly, "Looks like he's a mama's boy after all." End of chapter 6.
I love that one.
That one was so good.
Oh my god.
Oh my gosh.
Oh my god. I am so happy. My face hurts from smiling.
Really?
Yeah.
Aww.
This is so sweet. I want to cry. I loved it.
I know.
I
It's
loved it.
so good.